Alright, YouTube, Occult Video 41 on the topic of alchemy, something that a lot of people like to talk about. Some of the subjects I discuss are a little bit more arcane. Not many people are interested in really learning about them. Alchemy is certainly not one of them. Basically, anyone who's scratched the surface of the occult at least is familiar with the general concept. And the interplay of alchemy with chemistry and with the occult goes a little bit further, I think, than most people realize. A lot of times when occult works are read by an individual who's an occultist, they take it quite literally. I delve a level further. I look for hidden meanings within the occult works. Most of them have some sort of meaning. You have to read between the lines. The Rosary of the Philosophers that I'm currently half through illustrating. It's been edited. I'm just doing the illustrations, and I'm going to plop them in there and do the cover art, and then it'll be released. Certainly one of the longer alchemical manuscripts. Most of them, they're like 30 or 40 pages once they're translated and put into a modern form. This work's closer to 150. It's more of a full-length work. And it's quite in-depth. There are various figures that are listed in there and sort of the things that they've said about alchemy. One thing I think people don't understand, though, is that alchemy, properly understood, outside of the ritualized context of alchemy, that is really nothing more than proto-chemistry. It's a science. Literally, it's the same exact style of study. And if you read the Rosary of the Philosophers, you'll find something interesting. Now, this text dates to the middle of the 1500s. This isn't some 18th century scientific treatise on alchemy. It's from the Renaissance period. It's from the period in which people were practicing alchemy. And if you read through it and you think about what it's actually discussing, some of the terms are totally arcane. I had to update them. Some of the words don't even appear in any record. I can't find any other mention of them, and I can't really do anything with them, but most of them I can. If you look at the concepts at work there, the text itself explicitly states that those that are playing around with their roots and their dog skulls and things like that they're not doing alchemy. They're doing something totally different. This is a philosophical text. When we think of philosophy, we have to think of all of the physical sciences as being associated with what we would call, in the modern sense, philosophy. What we would call it is Socrates or something like that. We don't generally regard those working with herbs or those working with minerals as philosophers. In this sort of antiquated period, they were all under the same general umbrella term of philosophy. It explicitly states this, that that's nothing but superstition. It may be alluding to certain other, whatever came before the Grimorium Verum, the old Grand Grimoire or something in one of its very early forms. It could be referring to traditions such as that, or traditions that came before them, because that's really what you get. What they're talking about is essentially, with the whole text, the concept of Sol and Luna, the sun and the moon. They're talking about sulfur and mercury. It dwells, as all alchemical works do, on these two specific substances. They make a differentiation between pure mercury and sort of the other forms and ores and things like that, pure sulfur as opposed to some of the other materials as well. But if you look at the sections, and even the illustrations have a hidden meaning, by the way. If you look at the sections, if you look at what they're actually talking about, outside of the context of this, mix mercury and sulfur in such and such a way, and this is the process, and this is the magistery of the philosophers. This is how you make the stone of the philosophers. It does talk about that in an explicit sense. That's the more occult side. But if you look at the deeper meaning, the one that the reader is hidden from if they're just an illiterate lay person from the 1500s. And by the way, it specifically states that as well, that it has a hidden meaning. This text is very forthcoming, as opposed to most. If you look at those sections, what's it actually talking about? It's trying to detail to you the fermentation process, carbonization in an anaerobic environment, distillation in various ways, filtration, sublimation. These very scientific concepts that we would discuss in the field of biology or alchemy, the putrefaction process, things like that. And it simply couches them in mystic language, makes them more mystic than they actually are. That is, that this book, which is one book, contains two completely different stories. It's telling you first, this is how these physical processes operate, here's how you can experiment upon them. It goes into building a vessel for doing so, observing these processes, in some cases for many weeks. It talks about foliated earth. Now, foliated earth, this would have been seen as an occult concept. We would label it strictly chemistry. What are they talking about? It's the appearance after the earth is inundated with fluid, with water, for some amount of time. It gets these little white crystalline speckles. It looks almost like snow on top. What are they actually doing? They're leaching nitrates from it. They're making saltpeter. This is one of the bases upon which gunpowder in this same time period is formed. Of course, they dumped urine through straw and collected the nitrates that way. More efficient. This is sort of the earlier period. They're not really mass producing gunpowder in most parts of the world at this time. They're experimenting with extracting saltpeter. Talking about how to heat things without actually burning them. It could be alluding to the creation of the charcoal that would be necessary as well. And that same token, the purification of sulfur. Well, there you go. There's blasting powder. Sulfur, saltpeter, and ground charcoal. That's what they're talking about. These processes that they're alluding to. They're trying to instruct the intelligent person that's reading this in this time period is getting instruction couched in, oh, Lord Jesus, oh, Jehovah, most mighty, Sol and Luna, the great spheres of the heavens. They're getting a secular education on chemistry from this text. Those that are more spiritually minded are getting sort of a steganographic message regarding the state of divine philosophy. And the average layperson reading this, if they could read at all they're getting is, this is how you make this stone that will turn lead into gold. It's really remarkable. You're getting three separate stories from this one text. Alchemy operates differently upon different levels so often. Modern science, they look back at that period and say, oh, they didn't know anything. They didn't know what they were talking about. But they haven't stopped to consider the hidden meaning within these alchemical works. And the hidden meaning is these are chemical processes. These are processes that are at work within biology, within the natural sciences, within weathering and erosion, the leaching of compounds from the soil, all of these different things. It's not anything like what most people think of, and they think of, oh, well, they were trying to use mercury to make gold. They were trying to turn lead into gold. They were trying to make golems. They were trying to make homunculi. That sort of tradition often comes later. When you're talking about those things, a lot of times you're talking about the 1600s, not 1550. I think people don't understand that. And yes, upon the base level, yes, it is talking about purifying these materials through processes we currently do not understand to be true. However, it's also mentioning things like iron pyrite and all of these other things that could be passed off by a fraud as gold, and perhaps we might read into it a little deeper and think, oh, they're making fake gold, passing it off as real gold in order to finance their actual experiments. I think oftentimes that's what happened. The average person, indeed the average monarch back then, had no concept. They didn't know how gunpowder was made. They didn't know how wounds were healed with herbs. They didn't know anything. In fact, many of the monarchs were illiterate too. They couldn't read this book. They couldn't read any book. They couldn't even write their own name. So if you're an alchemist, if you're someone who is trained, you have studied philosophy, you know how to read and write, maybe you know 3 or 4 different languages, you can speak and write in Latin, you know all about herbal art, you're going to be a wizard. People back then would assume that you were a literal wizard. Of course you wore the robe and you set off the fireworks and did all of these other weird things. Because who's going to attack you? Who's going to order your death? Everyone's either afraid of you, or they think, well, this kingdom's going to fall in upon itself if it wasn't for our court wizard. They're not going to do shit. You're probably second only to the monarchs themselves in importance, and you're literate. You're going to outsmart them probably anyway, because you actually know how to communicate. You know architecture and mathematics and all of these things that many people didn't know. Essentially, a monarch in this period was an illiterate nobleman who simply owned a lot of land, didn't know how to grow anything, didn't know anything about anything really, was relying upon various skilled guilds in order to build everything, had to rely upon a bunch of fucking magicians in order to do everything else. That's basically the way things worked in this time period. We're not talking about having a literate middle class beyond a few merchants who traveled a lot and probably did pick up a few languages in their travels. We're talking about the early colonial period. And so, yeah, the Rosary of the Philosophers is an excellent work. It will be ready in the next few days, or at least that's my hope. If everything goes well, I should have it out in 3. And that'll be available. That would be one of the works I would strongly recommend for anyone who wants to get a look into the occult, especially within alchemy. This would be the longest, foremost alchemical text after maybe something written by Paracelsus or something like that. So yeah, Occult Video 41 on alchemy. It's not quite as it seems when people look back and say, oh, well, they didn't know what they were talking about. What they were talking about and what they were saying on the surface oftentimes are not entirely identical. That's about all. Peace out.